How many times have you seen regulators hug each other? You know, one of the things that Peggy mentioned was that I'm from New Mexico. And one of the things I always point out in this region, the states that she mentioned, Louisiana, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and New Mexico, in the history of EPA, which was born under the Nixon administration back in the early 70s, in the history of EPA, I am the first non-Texan to serve in this position. That's cool, especially for Louisiana and New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. Now, I know there's a lot of friends in here of mine that I've met that are from Texas or associated with their companies are associated with Texas. But since coming to EPA, I've learned so much. You know, I had the opportunity to work in New Mexico for Governor Bill Richardson for 8 years as his cabinet secretary for the environment. And when I come back and have the opportunity to speak in front or visit with people in the private sector, it reminds me of how I got into this business and the lessons that I learned from that still today. I was working for a company in Albuquerque, New Mexico called CEI Enterprises, which is still there. And our primary function was we built liquid asphalt storage and heating systems, which are used in the conjunction of making asphalt that we drive our cars on. And it was a small company of about 40 or 50 people. We rolled steel and we built heat transfer items that took hot oil and ran it through the bottom of a 30,000-gallon tank, heated liquid asphalt up to 300 degrees, and then that liquid asphalt was mixed with aggregate and it turned into a highway. And we sold our little product all over the world, primarily in the United States, but all over the world we had it going just about every place that you can imagine, usually with an asphalt plant made by someone else. The company's still there, very successful, and continues to be growing, but still a small company. So one day in the mid-'80s, we had the opportunity to sell a fairly large system for us. It was about 10% of our annual sales. We had the opportunity to sell it into the South Coast Air Quality Zone in Southern California, which is essentially the Los Angeles area. And in so doing, we were very excited because that meant that our welders were going to get to continue working and we're going to continue to meet payroll. And everybody in this room knows how important that is, no matter what size company you are. And so I got a call one day from the South Coast Air Quality Zone, and they said, "We understand that you've sold your equipment into our area." And I said, "Yes, we have." And I described for them what we'd sold. And they said, "Does the tanks that you're selling in here," and we assume that they have vent pipes in there so that air can move in and out of the tank as you pump the liquid asphalt in and out of the tank. And I said, "Yes, they do. Yes, of course they have those. We don't want the tank to collapse." They said, "We would like you to filter that vent pipe. So whatever atmosphere, whatever is coming out of that tank will not harm our air quality here in the South Coast Air Quality Zone." And I said, "Absolutely." And I said, "What kind of specifications, what kind of criteria would you like us to follow to meet this requirement?" And the response I heard was, "You just start and we'll tell you when you get it right." Okay, and I asked the question again, and I got the same answer. And I said, "Well, you know, we're a small company. We've got 40 to 50 folks. We've got 2.5 engineers. I'm the half, and you still don't have anything." They said, just begin, and we'll tell you when you get it right." This is an absolutely true story. This was 10% of our sales for the year. So we sat and put our heads together and we figured it out. It wasn't too complicated, but the message that I got then and the message that I still talk about today, whether it was when I was with the state of New Mexico or when I'm dealing with my colleagues at EPA or anyone that we deal with, is that we strive for clarity in what we're trying to do. And if we strive for clarity, we can often find ways that we can work together to get that job done. So that's an important message, and I told that story to Lisa Jackson when she asked me to come down and take this job. And so it's important that we keep in mind in our jobs every day that we work for that clarity. And when Gina McCarthy, who's the new administrator for EPA, she started out by talking about 7 themes that are important to her and important to all of EPA as we go forward for the next 3 years. And this morning, as I was listening to Mike Hayes and John White in one of the first panels this morning, I saw and I listened to some of those, I listened to all the statements you made, Mike. And so, but the thing that struck me is that the themes that Administrator McCarthy talks about, and I'll mention briefly here, and the things that I heard this morning coming from the state school superintendent, the state head, and from Mike and the others on the panel was that we have many things in common that we're trying to do. One of the things Gina talks about so often, and Peggy and I have talked about, is that environmental protection, environmental stewardship doesn't just take place at the federal government. It takes place at the state government, it takes place at municipalities, it takes place in your boardrooms, it takes place at the site of your plants. And we must all remember that because we all have different ideas. But on most days, I would say we're all working for that same outcome. And so one of the first and most important things that Gina talks about is collaboration. EPA is an agency of approximately 15 to 17,000 people, depending on the number of contractors that we have working for them. Region 6 has about 750 people. So obviously the size tells you that we have to collaborate to provide the sort of protections and guidance that we all need to get our jobs done. We have worked very hard in this region to do that sort of collaboration. And whether it's talking with Peggy, you know, or she's calling me, and we've called each other freely at any time. But those sort of communications are necessary, not just because it makes Peggy and I feel good when we talk with one another, but because the people that she represents and the constituencies in this room are both of our constituencies, and we have to remember that we're working for you, trying to assist you in what you're doing, and not trying to just see who we can muscle up on talking to one another. So collaboration means something. And I'll give you an example of the collaboration that we talk about in this region. EPA nationally so far has processed 44 greenhouse gas permits. The state of Louisiana, because it has delegated authority, has processed 12 greenhouse gas permits. The state of Texas still doesn't have full delegation for one reason or another. We have proposed that, and hopefully that'll come sometime in June. But we found ourselves about a year ago where we were looking at well close to, and sometimes over, depending on the day, 100 greenhouse gas permits that were sitting in our office, most of which, all of which, were from the state of Texas. So we all know how important those greenhouse gas permits are to this region. We all know that along the Gulf Coast, and I heard this figure mentioned this morning, or figures like this, along the Gulf Coast, including Texas and Louisiana, that we anticipate between $150 to $200 billion worth of investment in the next 5 years because of unconventional oil and gas drilling. And that unconventional oil and gas drilling calls for unconventional approaches to doing things. And that means that state regulators and federal regulators are co-regulators, and we have to look at things, do things that provide the clearest pathway to get things done. So that takes us back to the greenhouse gas permitting issue in Texas. So we had this backlog. I talked to Gina McCarthy this last December in her office in Washington, and she said, "This is not a good thing. Fix it." So we went about devising a plan where we worked with the state of Texas. We moved people around within our agency, both internally within Dallas, and also drew on some resources around the country. But one of the most unique things that we did was with the state of Texas, we entered into a work share program where they started working in a parallel path on these greenhouse gas permits with us. They started working on, I believe the number was something over 30. At the same time, we were processing them. So what that allowed to happen was that the permits could move faster, and then as we move toward the end, when they get their own delegation, the companies are allowed to choose whether they want to stay with the state of Texas to finish the process, or they want to stay with EPA to finish the process. But you stop and think, and I know some of you in this room are familiar with this, the relationship between EPA and the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality was not great. And that was an understatement. The relationship was not great. But because we were focused on the outcome, and because we knew we had to collaborate, because we knew that we're operating in a window of urgency when it comes to greenhouse gas permitting and the investments that were taking place along the coast, collaboration was the key to getting that environmental outcome that we all wanted. And to do so without sacrificing the quality of a greenhouse gas permit. So we have put out these permits. Some of them have been appealed to the Environmental Appeals Board, but the ones that have had a ruling on them so far have come out where the permits have stood. They've stood the ground of scrutiny. And the reason why is because there's a lot of quality that are in the permit that are the result of a lot of collaboration between the companies, between the state, between Dallas, and between Washington, D.C. So collaboration is just not a word to me. It's not a word to us. It's not a word to Peggy. It's something that we do because of many things. It also reduces transaction cost. Everybody in this room wants to reduce transaction cost because we all know where that reduction usually goes. And it's a good thing. So collaboration is important. Making a visible difference in the community is also important. And I heard this morning talking about education, talking about how you do things in communities. And so now, Mike, if you'll forgive me or allow me, talk about SASA a little bit. SASA came to us and we sat across the table in Dallas, Texas. And they were very blunt. They said, we have a large investment that we are considering. And in the process of doing this, they essentially were asking for our guidance or our thoughts on the best way to proceed with the community. Environmental justice is something that we deal with every day. It's part of this administration's main driving efforts. Region 6 has many environmental justice communities. Mossville is an environmental justice community. So when Sasol came in to visit with us, we had a very frank, I think, robust conversation. That's what they came there for. And we exchanged views about what they hoped to do, what they intended to do. And I would say, as I listened to Mike this morning talk about what they were doing and being concerned about the people there, the 20% that they're concerned about, and how you go about getting those people into the job market, and how you make it sustainable, which is another one of Gina's things, is so important, because that is what smart companies think about. They think about sustainability, they think about their work pool, they think about the quality of their work pool, and in the process of all that, they think about the environment that their working people, the pool that their workers are coming from, they think about the environment that they live in and the environment that they're going to raise their children in. So when we have that sort of robust conversation that was initiated by the company, I think it's a lesson and it's a model for all of us in that we are trying to find those outcomes that best serve the community and best serve what's going on along the Gulf Coast of here. But that collaboration, making a visible difference in the community, are two of the key things that we talk about every week with the administrator. Along with those, one of the things that people in this room are always concerned about on a daily basis are toxics and chemical safety. We all are aware of things that have happened in this state, what happened in the state of Texas. We're aware that the president has taken action in the form of executive orders asking for studies to be done, and some of the first actions that took place in the state of Texas. But you start weaving this in to the themes of the administrator and the themes of what we do, what you do in this room, you start to see that we have many things in common that we're trying to work for, that we're trying to deal with, that we're trying to search for that environmental outcome that is sustainable. And usually if it's sustainable, it not only has the environmental benefit, it has an economic benefit. EPA is proud to say over the years that we have provided, that the environmental actions of this agency are economic multipliers. Whether you're talking about greenhouse gas permits that are quality, or whether you're talking about trying to reduce asthma rates so health costs are reduced. These are economic multipliers. Climate change. Just yesterday, the climate assessment report was issued. And one of the nice things about this, one of the key authors, sometimes in Region 6 we think that we're down here by ourselves. We're down here in Region 6 that are producing between 62 and 68% of the oil and gas production in the United States. That's what we tell our folks throughout EPA. And with that comes a lot of other issues, as you all know, in this room. But one of the nice things about the climate assessment report that came out is that one of the key authors comes from Texas Tech, and that's West Texas. Texas Tech is one of the largest, they've got one of the largest wind farms and produces studies on wind than anywhere in the world. Texas is the largest export of Texas is the largest producer of wind energy in the world. But when you look at this climate assessment report, and I ask you all to go look at it, and you'll see the economic benefits are woven through it. But it's so important to remember that this is the third one. This was started back in 1989 and 1990 under the first Bush administration, that this climate assessment report started then. And it has to come out on a regular basis, which is turned into a semi-regular basis. But think of it in those terms and how we look at our planet and what we're doing for climate change. And then you look here in Louisiana. I think you could look here in Louisiana and you could say that you've been at the heart of climate resiliency forever. Not too many places in the United States can say that. There's a lot of things that come from other parts of this nation and this continent that flow through Louisiana. So whether you're talking about Highway 1 down in the southernmost part of the state where you've got subsidence and you've got the threat of climate change with rising sea levels, and you look at Highway 1, and this report talks about Highway 1, and that if we were to lose Highway 1, it would cost this country $7.8 billion annually. So there again you find when you're dealing with environmental issues, you have economic multipliers that you need to be aware of and deal with. So I say all that about Texas Tech just to, it made me feel good to know that one of the key authors is from this region. Because sometimes, we get pretty huffed up and puffed up about, being, most of the region is west of the Mississippi, with a little bit of here and there. And sometimes we think, gosh, we don't want to be forgotten. And then when we think about that number of 68 to 62% of the oil and gas production, I don't think anybody will forget that. And as Peggy and I talk about, along with climate change, and we're going to be doing a thing this afternoon to talk about ozone attainment and how Louisiana has worked, I believe in 5 parishes, to get back in attainment. And that's a big deal, and that's another example of being an economic multiplier. I bet Peggy's gotten more calls from businesses about ozone attainment than anyone else. Is that correct? I know when I was in New Mexico, I used to get calls from a community just outside of El Paso called Santa Teresa, which sits right on the Mexican border. It's a boom spot in New Mexico. It's a big boom spot in New Mexico, but they're always concerned about ozone and how it's going to impact them and how it's going to impact their economic growth. So it's something that we stay focused on and trying to work through the communities to make sure that the communities are doing things that keep them in attainment. So this afternoon is a success story. We also talked with Peggy a lot about protecting water, how important water is to all of us. If Gina McCarthy was here, she would talk about climate change, and in the next breath she would say, you can't separate climate change from water. In New Mexico, which is called the land of enchantment by those of us who love it, we get an annual rainfall of 8 inches a year. First time I came down here to visit with Peggy, we landed in New Orleans, driving up to Baton Rouge, and it was raining. This was like in October or so of 2012, and it was raining, and I told David, I said, stop the car, I want to feel what it feels like. Because this year, and actually over the last 18 months, instead of that flood of rain that we get of 8 inches, we've gotten 4.5 inches. So that will make our green chilies hotter. That's the only benefit I can think of. One of the things that, you don't want to get too far down in the weeds in, but I want to mention it, and that's that one of Gina's themes is making EPA a high-performing organization. That sounds like inside baseball maybe, but if we become a higher performing organization, the benefactors are going to be you and the environment. whether it's finding a better way to get greenhouse gas permits out, or whether it's finding a way to reduce those transaction costs, the benefit comes back to the public. And EPA is dedicated to doing that, whether it's talking about finding a more efficient way of having our IT work so that we can get communications better between us and the public, or whether it's reducing the number of cell phone contracts that we have across the nation. And it's amazing how many cell phone contracts we have. But that's something that we talk about. That's something that Bob Perciasepe, who's the Deputy Administrator, talks about. And it's important because we're striving to be high-performing, trying to be more efficient, and the result comes back to you. I've been in this business since the early 90s. And I think one of the things that has occurred to me and still occurs to me every day and is so important that I hope you all realize this about whether it's Peggy Hatch and her organization or EPA. And I've said this when I was Secretary of the Environment in New Mexico. And I've said this since I've been administrator here in Region 6. And I bet many of you say this to the folks that you work with or have these thoughts. I ask our folks to think about them this way, is that when they come to work every day in Dallas or Baton Rouge, when they come to work every day, they have a unique opportunity that a lot of people don't have. Is if you're working in the environmental field, you have the opportunity to have either a direct or indirect positive effect on your community. Not all occupations have that opportunity. But if you're in the environmental business, you have that. You have that challenge every day to have a positive, direct effect on your community. So if you stop and think about that, and then I'll move back into the governmental sector, and I heard Mike talk about, Sasol being a little bit bureaucratic this morning at times. But I ask our folks who work in Dallas and in Houston and in El Paso and in Oklahoma, I say at the end of each day, and this comes from the bottom of my heart, at the end of each day, when you go home, I want you to be able to say to yourself that you are not a bureaucrat, that you are a public servant. And I think if you're able to say that, then you're going to have that environmental and economic outcome that we seek every day when we come to work. Thank you all very much.